Okay, council has returned from closed session. I have the city attorney provide us a report.
Mayor, I'd be happy to do that. There were 3 items on your closed session agenda for your 4 o'clock session. The first was a conference with your labor negotiator. The second was a conference with legal counsel with 1 item of existing litigation, and the third was a conference with legal counsel, 1 item of anticipated litigation. Council completed the discussions with regard to all 3, although direction was given to the city manager on item 1 and direction to city attorney on item 3 and 3B and 3C. There was no other reportable action at this time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And with that, I'll close the closed session and welcome everybody to a work study session, January 28th, 2020 work study session. And we'll call that meeting to order. And Deputy City Clerk, I have a roll call, please.
Mayor Brown?
Here.
Mayor Pro Tem Krupa?
Here.
Councilmember Meyer?
Here.
Councilmember Percival? Here. For the record, Councilmember Wright is absent.
I have a motion to excuse Councilmember Wright.
So moved.
Second.
Please vote. That passes unanimously. On to public comment. At this time, members of the public may only comment on an item appearing on the agenda. Please adhere to the following when addressing the council. Comments will be limited to 3 minutes or less. Comments should be directed to the council as a whole and not directed to any individual council member. Are there any members of the public that would like to comment on the work study item?
No, Mayor Brown, I haven't received any requests.
Okay. Thank you. Then we'll go on to item 3A as a work study session to discuss financial model. And we have a staff report from Director Roach.
So I'll go ahead and set the stage and provide a little background on this item. Mayor and Council, as you know, over the last few months we have been preparing a financial model that would help the City Council in making decisions based on the budget or other financial considerations for the City of Hemet. And so I first off want to thank the Finance Department under the leadership of Lorena. This was something that took months to develop, and we've been working on it since probably June or July of last year when we've refined it, been working on it and making changes to it. So thank you to Lorena and the Finance Department for putting this together and really taking the lead on this item. So with that being said, a little bit of background on this item. In July of 2015, the California State Auditor informed the City of Hemet that it had been selected for review under the high-risk local government agency audit program. The program authorizes the state auditor to identify local government agencies that are at high risk for potential waste, fraud, abuse, or mismanagement, or that have major challenges associated with their economy, efficiency, or effectiveness. Hemet was initially identified as an entity that might be classified as a high-risk local government entity based on publicly available information. The state auditor conducted an initial assessment of Hemet in July and August of 2015. Although the auditors did not observe any conditions related to fraud or abuse, they did identify concerns regarding Hemet's persistent budget deficits and high retiree medical benefit costs. So back in May or June of 2019, I flew up and met with the state auditor's staff and talked about some of the lingering items that were on that list. As a result of that, they did provide a update on some of the items that we talked about, as well as some of the things that they could expect from the City of Hemet and the management team as it relates to some of those outstanding items. One of those items that they did note was the financial model, so shortly thereafter we started the undertaking of this model. On August 4th, 2016, the state auditor issued a report where it outlined the areas of concern for the city. One of those areas of concern was the ongoing budget deficit. Although the city had reserves to cover the shortfall, expenditures had exceeded revenues in 8 of the previous 9 fiscal years. In response to this specific finding, the city staff prepared a 5-year revenue and expenditure projections model. However, the state auditor noted in its May 2017 report that the city's projections were inaccurate and overly optimistic at that time. So before we get started on this item, I wanted to lay out a couple concepts for the community. The International City and County Management Association, ICMA, has produced a document titled Evaluating Financial Condition, a Handbook for Local Government. One of the quotes that's included at the beginning of that document is from an individual from Standard & Poor's Rating Group. The ability to evaluate the financial condition of a local government, whether by key decision makers within the local government, taxpayers, rating agencies, bondholders, or other parties, is critically important in today's information age. Obviously, many cities are having to go through this process and completely understand the liabilities, revenues, expenditures, and what that means for the fiscal sustainability of their respective agency. So we'll talk about a few key terms in the presentation, and I wanted to provide those just as definitions so that we could move forward. Again, these are items that are referred to in the document put out by the ICMA that I referred to. Financial condition. So in purely an accounting sense, it means a government's ability to generate enough cash over 30 or 60 days to pay its bills. So this is referred to as cash solvency. You'll recall that when San Bernardino, the city of San Bernardino, went through its bankruptcy, they had a cash solvency issue. It didn't have the ability to pay payroll for the next couple weeks or so. So they had a cash problem. Financial condition can also refer to a government's ability to generate enough revenues over its normal budgetary period to meet its expenditures and not incur deficits. This refers to budgetary solvency. In addition to those items, it also means a government's ability in the long run to pay all the costs of doing business, including expenditures that normally appear in each annual budget, as well as those that will appear only in the years in which they must be paid. Pension costs and post-employment benefits are examples of these. Although these costs will appear in a budget or otherwise make themselves known, a short-run financial analysis may not reveal them. And what they mean by a short-run financial analysis is anything from the 1 to 5 year projection. So this long-run balance, anything beyond the 5 years, balance between revenues and costs warrants separate attention and is referred to here as long-run solvency. So there's a difference between some of the immediate short-term items and then some of the long-term items that impact future budget years. And finally, financial condition can refer to a government's ability to provide services at the level and quality that are required for the health, safety, and welfare of the community and that its citizens desire. So this is referred to as service level solvency. And you'll note that there's a relationship between all of those. Not having the cash impacts your ability to provide services to the community, and that in turn impacts your service level solvency. So part on the background on how we developed this model, we analyzed revenues, year-to-date revenues, as well as historical revenues, as well as information that we received from HDL, who is a consultant to the city and provides information to the city in terms of how sales tax, property tax are trending, and provides the information to the city to make projections in its budget, as well as future year projections for the city. So we took all of that data as one component for this financial model. We looked at expenditures, and we looked at year-to-date expenditures. We looked at actual expenditures. You'll notice that in one of the columns we have unaudited actual expenditures that are included. And so we use that on the expenditure side to project out future years' expenditures. Some of the key assumptions that are included there will be in the next slide that Lorena will talk about. But some of those items, in creating this model, we just had to assume a number of items. And so some of those assumptions are a lot bigger than others, primarily when it comes to the economy, what we expect the local economy to be. And so in those instances, we've had to make assumptions that obviously impact the revenue projections as well as some of the expenditure items in this model. We used a vast number of data to do that, not only numbers, but we used MOUs. We looked at a number of service obligations, including contracts like the Ramona Animal Shelter, to include cost of living or inflationary measures within those contracts, to really get a better picture of what those expenditures are truly going to be in the next few years. After we took all of those items, we sat down over countless meetings and discussed it. Did we include this? Did we include that? What did we do on this? What did we do on that? Finally, to where we got to the point where we had a model that we felt confident in, that captured the items that were of importance, to include them in the financial model. So with that being said, that's kind of the background to that. So we'll go ahead and hand it over to Lorena to talk about the financial model in more detail.
Thank you. Good evening, Council. So some of the assumptions that we used in preparing this model included a 2% growth in sales and property taxes, and that was based on information that was provided from HDL, historical data, what we see trends doing. We also looked at PERS, workers' compensation increases. We're estimating a 4% increase just because of how fast our PERS rates have been increasing, how fast our workers' comp has been increasing over the last few years. We looked at MOU increases for public safety, that those MOUs will expire in fiscal year 2021. So we do have that accounted for through 2021, and then after that we don't expect, or we're not accounting for any other increases beyond that. On the non-safety side, we're not accounting for any increases at all. We're assuming status quo salaries. There will obviously be some increases to benefits because they're mainly out of our control. Workers' comp is out of our control, PERS is out of our control. 2% contract increases for materials and supplies for maintenance and operations, and that is in a lot of ways out of our hands. For some of it, we can offset some. We see price increases on materials that we get, but we see savings in other line items, so we reduce it a little bit. But there's a lot of contracts that we pay for, software, our maintenance agreements for equipment that we have, various machines in our facilities, that there's really no way around it. So we assume a 2% increase there. Measure U was removed from the first section, so the first section of the presentation will strictly be general fund, excluding Measure U. There won't be revenues, there won't be expenditures related to Measure U. We're assuming continued economic growth. We're not taking into account a recession right now. And for fiscal year 1920, you will see that we did use the council-approved one-time use of $1.2 million to close the budget gap on the general fund side. So you'll see that only in 1920. We don't continue to use that in future years because that's not been discussed yet, and we can't assume that that will be approved.
And also, too, that 1.2 allocation was used only for public safety in the general fund.
One of the biggest things, and something that I look at regularly, question HDL about regularly, is the impact of a recession. Last year, when they were out, when they talked to us on numerous occasions, they said we were at risk. They could see it coming in the next year or two. The last time we met with them, they said that risk seems to have gone away. So we completed this assuming no recession. We completed it assuming that we're going to continue to trend at least with a small increase. Unfortunately, the increases are on both sides of that equation. Okay. So for the general fund, what you see here is the revenue projections for fiscal years 2019-2020 through fiscal years 2024-2025. In fiscal year 1920, you see a spike, and it really has to do with a lot of one-time fundings that we're using to close that gap. So it's the $1.2 million from Measure U. It's using one-time available balances in some of our internal service charges to not charge the general fund. It's using vacancies, anything else that we used as a one-time stopgap measure. So you'll see it's at 42.7 million, and then in 2021, we're projecting it's going to drop to 41.3 million. And again, the difference is the one-time uses of funds that we did only for 1920. We can't assume that those are ongoing, so we took those out of the equation. As it moves forward to the following years, that's accounting for the 2% increases for sales tax and property tax, and then some minimal increases in things like permits and things like that. I didn't want to be over-optimistic because I'm trying to be realistic. We have been in an economic environment where we've been growing and growing and growing over 10, 11 years, and that's not common. So while we may not have a recession, I don't expect to see that much growth. We may just flatten out, but I'm not expecting a huge growth, and I'm hoping for no recession.
I should also add that in fiscal year 1920, I'll call it the artificial spike in revenues was due to those one-time revenues, including equipment replacement funds. And I have to say that in this year, there were about $700,000 in public safety equipment replacement costs on the general fund side that had been accrued for a number of years, monies that were set aside, and that was one of the last resorts that we had to utilize that funding to help shore up that gap. So those one-time funding sources are no longer there anymore because we've exhausted almost all of them to help balance the budget.
On the expenditure side, we're expecting expenditures to grow over $7.5 million over the next 5 years. The biggest jump that you see is in fiscal year 2021. This is the last year of the public safety MOUs. And then after that, salaries are projected to be flat. But again, there's a lot of things that are out of our control. We can't control PERS, workers' comp, liability insurance, contracts, and whatnot. So you see those progressively increasing until 24-25, where we're at $50,213,000 in expenditures. And this does include public safety, but again, not Measure U public safety. So when we put those two side by side, revenues and expenditures, in fiscal year 1920, Council did pass a balanced budget, so you do see that those are equal. In 2021, because of the spike in expenditures, you do see a big jump on that green bar, which are your expenditures, and they continue to go up, which means that if we don't find a way to close that gap, that our reserves are going to be gone. Again, some of the key points from this model. Non-safety salaries are projected to stay flat, so there wasn't an increase to cost there. Non-safety benefits are slated to increase because of PERS and workers' comp. Public safety salaries are projected to increase only for the 2021 year because it's the last year of the MOU agreements, and with it, benefits will increase as well. So for Measure U, Resolutions 4731 and 4703 affirm that the council's desire is to expend Measure U revenues on public safety and ensure that no less than 72% of general fund revenues are appropriated for public safety operations. In fiscal year 1920, this amount is approximately 75%. 75% of the general fund revenues are used to cover public safety costs. In fiscal year 2021, we will need to allocate 85.7% of the general fund revenues for public safety, and the other 14.3% that is left is to run all other city services, community development, the services that service all of the other departments.
So that's really where the issues get created, because we know that those other departments don't, they're going to need more than 14.3% to operate. And so what's happening is I'll call it the floor was created with the 72%, but as that number gets higher and higher and higher, it squeezes out the rest of the non-safety departments and operations to the point where it's creating that budget deficit. So short of another stream of revenues or another fund to pull that from, we deal with those budget deficits, and that's really what's driving these issues. That last year I think we started the beginning of the budget conversations of public safety being around 78%. The use of $1.2 million of Measure U for the general fund brought that lower to 75%. But with the increases that are projected to happen in fiscal year 2021, that jumps up to 85.7%.
This next slide looks at ending fund balances. So for fiscal year 18-19, we ended the year with $11.6 million. That meant that we met our 20% reserve requirement, that we were able to continue respecting all of the restricted funds that are also within general fund, things like anything that's prepaid, our PEG fees, things like that. In 1920, that amount is expected to be $11,707,000. Again, still enough to cover our 20% reserve as well as our restricted funds, and still leaving us about $1.7 million in unrestricted fund balance. In fiscal year 2021, although we end the year with, we're projected to end the year with just under $6.5 million in revenues or in fund balance, that is not enough to cover our 20% reserve. Our 20% reserve for fiscal year 2021 is $9.3 million, and our fund balance is supposed to end at 6.5. That means we have a deficit of $4.4 million that we don't have to cover. So at that point, either something needs to change or the council would have to declare a fiscal emergency to be able to use the 20% reserve to continue to operate the city. And as the years go on, 21, 22, 22, 23, 24, 23, 24, and 24, 25, that number continues to decrease. By the end of 24, 25, we're at a deficit of $15.6 million. That means we have nothing for our reserves. We've spent all of our restricted funds, and we're probably borrowing that $15 million from another fund. So we're going to have to figure out how to close that gap. For Measure U, it's important that everybody understands that the exact same assumptions that were used for the general fund side were used for the Measure U side. If we projected increases in sales tax on the general fund side, we projected them on the Measure U side. If we projected increases in costs, whether it be for operation, whether it be for PERS, for workers' comp, we projected them in Measure U, so that we're on the same, on a level playing field. We're not treating the two differently because they're not. So the first slide here will show you general fund revenues, and it starts here with fiscal year 1920. And the reason you only see 10 million allocated to Measure U revenues is because, again, Council approved the use of $1.2 million for general fund. So we're only assuming that they have $10 million to spend in 1920. As the years progress, we do expect, again, a 2% increase. So where it would have been 11.2 for 1920, in 2021 it'll increase to 11.3, and so on until we're at 12.1 million at the end of 24-25. On the expenditure side, we started by showing actual expenditures unaudited for 18-19. That was $7,016,000. In 1920, you see a big spike. That's because they have several one-time items in there. So they have the replacement of the radio system. They have some vehicles and some other one-time items that won't be there the following year. Hence the big drop in 2021 back down to 8.8. The Measure U plan, the original plan, was written so that the first 4 years were increasing staffing on the public safety side. And then in the 5th year, in 2021, it goes into maintenance mode. So even though it goes into maintenance mode, you still see increases because of things like PERS and workers' comp and liability insurance and whatnot that are out of our control. So even though we're just in maintenance mode, you still see increases.
I should add on that slide too, you'll notice that in fiscal year 1920, if you'll recall, the projected revenues were projected to be about $10.0 million with the use of $1.2 million of Measure U for public safety in the general fund. If you look at fiscal year 1920, you'll see that the expenditures are actually higher than the revenues that are received. You'll recall that public safety had requested to utilize fund balance to make some additional purchases this year, including the replacement of its radio system. So that's why the expenditures are higher than the revenues, because when the budget was presented, we had requested to use fund balance to make the purchase above, or to have an expenditure above the $10 million mark.
This here shows the original plan for Measure U. What was expected to happen in year 1, year 2, years 3 and 4, and then if you look at years 5 through 10 on both for police and fire, they show that now we're supposed to be in maintenance mode, so we're not projecting to continue increasing. Doesn't mean that everything happened just as it was laid out originally, because as you've heard from both chiefs, it hasn't been possible to do that in every year, but we have to look ahead at the 10 years, and we can't continue to have it increasing over the next 5 years. So this again is a side-by-side comparison, revenues versus expenditures, the blue bar being the revenues, the green being the expenditures. The only year that you see expenditures being greater than revenues is in the current year, 1920, because of the one-time expenditures. In all the other years, you see that they do have a surplus in funds. They started this year with about 11.6 million in surplus funds, and then it'll only continue to grow from there. So again, public safety salaries are projected to increase only through fiscal year 2021. Public safety benefits are projected to increase, unfortunately, through the end of the model date range 24-25, and revenues are projected to continue to increase. But just like on the general fund side, this is only assuming that we don't have a recession. This shows Measure U's projected fund balances. It starts with the actual fund balance left at the end of 18-19 of $11,680,000. In 19-20, you do see a drop because of the one-time expenditures. And then in 2021, you start to see it increasing again, 12 million, then 14, until at the end of 24-25, we're expected to end the year with $21.7 million in unspent Measure U revenues.
So I'll add on that. You'll note that some of the initial projections that were done by the city of the fund balance of Measure U at year 2024-2025 were lower than what we projected them out to be, and that's partly due to the higher revenues that we're seeing, as well as some of the lower expenditures that we're seeing in public safety. So that's that projection is more than what was projected in years past, and that's our projection on that based on what we've seen here to date and what we project to see in the future. So you'll notice that in fiscal year 18-19, the ending fund balance of Measure U was $11.7 million. You see by 2024-2025 that the ending fund balance is projected to be $21.7 million. So what we did next was we took a hypothetical situation, and the question that we had was, what happened if we were to combine Measure U and the general fund, and even just said that Measure U would just be used for public safety overall for the city of Hemet. So assuming that Measure U was lumped in with general fund, you'll see that the red arrow indicates where expenditures still exceed revenues. This is the structural deficit that started in the general fund and only continues since the spending has not been addressed in the general fund. So what you have is you've got increased expenditures in Measure U. You haven't addressed your expenditure issue in the general fund. So essentially Measure U is utilized to close that gap. And so that's how you deal with the increase in expenditures versus your revenues. The blue line represents your revenues. Your green represents your expenditures. So you can see that expenditures are outpacing your revenues, which is creating the budget deficit issue. So with that being said, if the council wished to combine Measure U into the general fund, it will be unable to meet its 20% reserve in 2022-2023. And that's because, again, as I mentioned, if your Measure U funds are now being used to deal with your general fund revenue and expenditure problem, that deficit just gets covered by Measure U, and so you need those funds, those excess funds, to cover your budget deficit. So by 2022, 2023, the city would not be able to meet its emergency reserve. Combining Measure U into the general fund means that approximately 85% of the revenues will be allocated for public safety, leaving 15% of the remainder of city operations. So again, as Measure U, purely the hypothetical, gets put into the general fund, you haven't addressed your general fund expenditure issue. So that's the issue that you just continue to have. Maintaining current service levels and the use of Measure U will slowly erode the fund balance, leaving the city cash insolvent. So again, this goes back to the idea of having cash available to meet its obligations. The use of Measure U will just prolong that kind of the ongoing operations. But as we look, we only used 5 years projections. If we put out 5-year projections beyond the 5, you would see that at some point the city would not have the Measure U fund balance available at all and would have no general fund balance at all. So this is a graph that illustrates that concept. You'll see that in Assuming that it was combined, let's say in fiscal year 18-19, the Measure U and general fund balance would be $23.3 million at the start of 2018. 2019, by the time it gets to 2024, 2025, it has reduced down to $6.1 million. And again, that's the budget deficit in the general fund side.
And just to give you an idea, the 20% reserve requirement, if they were to be combined, is $11.9 million in 24-25, of which $8 million will have to be used, and then we'll end up with $6 million.
So again, unless service levels are reduced or significant new revenues are brought in, the city will begin to deplete Measure U fund balance to make up that deficit. So the structural deficit in the general fund and the current spending levels in Measure U will lead to budget insolvency. The use of Measure U to make up for the difference in the general fund will not be enough to get out of the financial hardship that the city has been for the past number of years. Service levels are unsustainable, and without significant changes, the city is at risk of significant financial challenges leading to cash insolvency. So some more key takeaways that are listed here. The passage of Measure U did not address the consistent budget deficiencies in the general fund. As you see other communities that pass sales tax measures, one of the things that they are putting out there is that it's to maintain service levels and not have any reductions in its service levels. One of the differences in the city of Hemet was that it added service levels. If you go to the fiscal year 15-16 budget, the budget was adopted with a $5 million deficit. And so had the conversation revolved around Measure U being utilized to not impact service levels, then that would have been a different conversation. However, adding those additional service levels has meant that the general fund service levels have been sustained with the use of general fund balance, including equipment replacement funding and other sources of funding to help make the budget balance. The additional service levels as a result of Measure U did not address the city's inability to provide levels of service prior to Measure U. Again, it's the concept that it was unable to provide levels of service at the levels back then. Measure U did not do anything to address that issue moving forward. So without significant changes, including reductions of expenditures or increased revenues, the city will not be able to ensure budgetary, cash, long-run, and service solvency. Any changes in the local economy will significantly alter the numbers in the model. So the next steps for staff. In February, we plan on bringing a mid-year budget review, which we will provide an update to the council on where we are about halfway through the fiscal year. I've made some changes in how the city deals with something as simple as continuing appropriations. I've had the chance to talk to a couple of the council members about that. The concept for a number of years has been if a line item in a budget isn't expended in one year, it gets continued into the next year. My position on that is that becomes a capacity problem. So if the funding is allocated in one budget year and it isn't spent in that fiscal year, then there's a capacity issue. So we need to have a conversation about what's the likelihood of us utilizing that funding in that budget year. And so we will bring to the council where we need to make new appropriations. We will do that during mid-year.
And just to be clear, those continuing appropriations aren't everything that is not spent. It's not office supplies, it's not unspent salaries or anything like that. It's projects that are in there. But there are projects that have carried forward for 4 or 5 years, I believe is what I was showing Chris. And those are the ones that we're concerned about.
We will begin the budget development for fiscal year 2020-2021. So we will refine the revenues and work with our departments in making sure that we're going through the line items that we need to. And then if the council desires starting a budget ad hoc committee, might make some sense so that we can provide information as we move along throughout the budget process. So just to recap some of the items that how we balance the budget in fiscal year 19-20. The initial deficit for fiscal year 19-20 was projected at $5.2 million. In fiscal year 18-19, that deficit was initially pegged at $3.5 million. So you see that there's a growing deficit in the general fund. Some of the budget balancing measures that we talked about during the course of the presentation. We removed equipment replacement for fiscal year 19-20. We utilized one-time fund balances, including equipment replacement and facilities maintenance projects that we essentially defunded and said that we were not going to complete. That brought an anticipated savings of approximately $2 to $2.5 million. Some of the additional items that we had to employ, we eliminated vacant positions primarily in the Public Works Department and the Facilities Maintenance Division, and we used a number of other balancing measures, including keeping positions vacant to close that gap. So with that being said, that concludes the presentation from staff. We'd be happy to answer any questions that the council might have.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Chris and Lorena, for that in-depth walkthrough, even though it's not a rosy picture. We'd be doing ourselves a disservice if we didn't look at it very bluntly, and that's part of our job. Do we have any requests from the public to speak?
No, Mayor, there are no requests.
Okay. Council, have any questions or comments of staff?
I guess my comments would be, it is very sobering. I'm glad we've done this in a realistic approach. It definitely shows us where we need to go. And then my next question would be, how soon are we having our semi-annual retreat to really dig into where we want to go, how we want to go, and what the objectives are of council, say, going forward 5 to 10, and staff going forward 5-10 years?
So are you referring to strategic planning conversations? So I have one follow-up conversation. I believe it's either tomorrow or Thursday with one potential group. And so I imagine within a week or two I'll have a decision, execute a contract, and then hopefully shoot for maybe February to start those conversations.
Thank you. Everybody buy a lottery ticket.
Okay, so I think that we've had this conversation in the past about Measure U becoming a burden on the budget. And I know I've had this conversation with Chris about under the resolution, Measure U is for public safety. And yet public safety continues to increase the burden on the general fund. You're projecting on your slide, and I want to say slide 13, I believe, shows that public safety is at 85% of the general fund, where the resolution clearly states in there that it's not to dip below 72%. And yet all we're doing is creating more and more and more and more and more in public safety. Why don't we just make the budget 100% public safety, and then let public safety pay for everything that the city does? And there's our workaround around all of Measure U. But that's not realistic. There needs to be I think from my perspective is that there's too much separation with this is Measure U and this is the general fund. Measure U is general fund, period. And what I think has been made very difficult in this process is that we should be looking at, okay, this is what our revenue projections are, and we're going to allocate 72% of that or 75% of that to public safety, and then all the Measure U money gets split and goes to public safety as part of their budget, and say, here you go, figure it out. Hire as many people as you can get hired, buy as much equipment as you can get purchased. This is part of your budget. And we're trying to make it, and it's becoming so, we've got now this budget deficit that we shouldn't have. Because the revenues and the carryovers for Measure U continue to go up and up and up and up. And the general fund continues to go down and down and down and down. And at what point do we file bankruptcy, yet we've got all this money sitting in the bank that we're not spending on public safety? So that's my concern. I mean, we've got this money that's supposed to be allocated to public safety, and yet it's still accruing every year because public safety can't spend it fast enough. We can't get people hired because everybody else is hiring, and it's making it difficult. I get that. Our public safety guys have it tough already, and we're just making it more difficult. So that's my, and I do have, so I want to point something out because it's relevant. So Thursday I was at the League of Cities, and for a policy committee for revenue and taxation, all they want to do is talk about how they're going to tax more to go to the state, but yet they're not going to allocate funds to the cities where the state is creating all these burdens on the cities. And one of the conversations was all these cities are passing use taxes so that they can pay for everything, because PERS is going up, workers' comp's going up, insurance is going up, everything's going up, and yet the state continues to pull back their resources, kicking people out of prison and whatever, and not making anything easier. So the cities have to become self-reliant, which is unfortunate, because then the state, in the budget, they were talking about having another $6 billion in surplus. So I leaned over to my colleague from San Jacinto and said, so are they going to give that back to the taxpayers? Of course not. And they're not going to pass it down to the cities. So I think that, personally, I think if we're making it more difficult than it really needs to be, at the detriment to the entire city. And that's not what Measure U was intended for. It was intended to increase public safety, but not create a burden. There was nowhere in the language of the resolution that said you're now going to use Measure U to burden the rest of the city. So that's my rant. I think I had another. You talked about the reserve amount. So you said that if in the hybrid model, if there was a combined Measure U and general fund, that we would, over the term, by 2025, I think we would dip below that 20% reserve. I think we've already got a 20% reserve built into Measure U as well.
Right, and this combines them. This combines them.
So I don't understand how we're going to dip below if we already have a reserve requirement under Measure U.
Because now you only have one reserve requirement, and the reserve requirement is 20% of expenditures is what we're supposed to set aside. So in any of these given years, all I did was take 20% of the expenditure totals projected and said, like in 22-23 for the hybrid model, our projected expenditures, everything together, general fund and Measure U, $57.5 million. 20% of that is $11.5 million. We're projected to end the year with $12,343,000, which means we'll meet our 20% reserve minus about $1 million that will be shy. So are we going to take it from the reserves, or are we going to take it from restricted funds that legally we shouldn't even touch, such as PEG fees? And then it gets progressively worse in 23-24 and 24-25. So while we will end 24-25 with money in the bank, we won't be cash insolvent because we'll have $6 million in the bank. We don't have enough to cover a 20% reserve requirement. So the reserve requirement would either have to be lowered or an emergency would have to be declared.
What's really, again, it's the concept of there's a the expenditure issue on the general fund side, which is the deficit issue that we've largely solved through the use of one-time fund balances. Last year we talked about the use of the refuse franchise initial payment that the city had received. Anything above that 20% emergency reserved had been used to slowly fund year after year ongoing operations. Last year was the first year where we were at the point where we had used all of the fund balance above the 20%, and we were in the position of having to either declare a fiscal emergency or employ some of the other items that we talked about, including the $1.2 million of Measure U and general fund for public safety, and deleting positions from public works. So it's really that issue of the expenditure issue on the general fund side that's causing the budget deficit. So the Measure U fund balance could potentially be used to help offset that deficit, but that expenditure issue is still going to remain year after year after year, and you only have so much Measure U fund balance to pay for that. It's that concept of when Measure U was adopted, the fact that the conversation revolved around additional new services, when the conversation probably should have been around maintaining service levels and not having to deal with reducing services.
Okay, so this report is great. I like it. I hate to say that this is not new news to us. Let me see the date on this. October 8th, 2018, we had a discussion up here about this. And I made this pie graph, and I showed you all this pie graph. And this is a pie graph that has 79% of our budget for public safety, 21% for the rest of the city. So that 160 employees are operating under the 79%, and this was 2 years ago. And the argument, if you want to say, that Mike and I had was, we are not using the Measure U money for public safety. We're saving it. And we promised the people that we would have change. And so today, this has increased to 85.7. So I can do a new comparison and see how small our little green chart has gotten for the rest of the city. And it's no surprise. I mean, we've been talking about this since we've been elected. And I don't think that we will be, call it whatever you want with the wording. We're not using the Measure U money for public safety if it's sitting in the bank. If it's sitting in the bank, we're not seeing changes on our streets. Yes, we have increased and we've made changes, and the people can see some, but they are still demanding more. As we are constantly fighting the crime issue, we're sitting on this money. So we're not using it as we promised. And we promised to use it on public safety. So now our pie is getting smaller and smaller, and yes, we need to use the Measure U money to fund public safety. If that's the question, that's my vote.
Thank you, Carly. I have kind of a simplistic question, I think, to start off with. If the commitment within the Measure U resolution was that 72%, not less than 72% general fund supports public safety, and yet the projection is going all the way up to 85%. So my simple question is, what is that 13% difference? Where is that coming from? What is it going to that's causing that to continue to climb?
The 5-year MOU agreements with public safety. So when those agreements were signed and passed, which was just after Measure U was passed, what that did was increase the cost for public safety on the general fund side it didn't just increase the cost on the Measure U side, it also increased the portion that was general fund. So if 72%, well, let me think about how I'm going to word this. The officers that were already on board, the firefighters that were already on board, all of our public safety personnel that was already on board, that was being paid for out of the general fund before Measure U was passed. And those officers, those firefighters were still on board. After Measure U was passed, and after those MOUs were signed. Now those MOUs said that our financial obligation to those public safety employees was higher, but we weren't to touch Measure U to pay for it because those officers belong to general fund, so why would Measure U pay for it? So that increased the cost on the general fund side.
And I appreciate you walking us through that, and I think in my estimation, that's kind of the root issue that Carly and Michael, and I have to agree, and I can recall that budget discussion, and I remember really being on the cusp of which way I wanted to go, and thinking that because it was the first year, and yes, we were realizing a surplus, we had no assurance that that was going to be continued. And so for that reason, I opted for a different approach to balancing. But I just pulled up the resolution 4703 again.